Hey all you whiskey lovers, have you ever seen sherry written on every single whiskey bottle you can possibly imagine and wondered, hey, what do all these different types of sherries mean and which ones do I like, which ones don't I like, maybe based on the flavors I like or don't like? Well, let's get into it. Grab a glass. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a lot to learn about sherry. Just like whiskey, it's its own category, and there's a lot you can peel apart and learn about it. What's important is sherries come out of the Sherry Triangle in the south of Spain, and there is a lot of good sherry to try on its own, even before it goes into a barrel or is made into a seasoned barrel for aging and maturing whiskey. Today we're going to talk about the 5 major types of sherry that I see on the whiskeys that I own at home and the whiskeys that I usually see and like at bars. Starting off with the most popular Oloroso sherry barrels, or sherry in general. I say barrels because a lot of the time in whiskey you're going to see it finished in a Oloroso sherry barrel or hogshead, or you might get the size of the barrel, how many liters it can fit. But Oloroso is probably one of the most popular types of sherry finishes. Now I'm going to butcher all these names, but Oloroso comes from a city called Jerez. Again, this is in the south of Spain. It is made of a palomillo, again, butchered, but variant of grape. It is a full-bodied, strong, and a dry grape. If you have a sweet Oloroso sherry, it's probably been fortified or had different types of sherry mixed into it to bring out the sweetness, because that's not typical of an Oloroso. In fact, Oloroso is not used because of its sweet notes or characters, but mainly because of how it complements a whiskey, especially a Scottish whiskey, enhancing and bringing forward some of the flavors that we like in the single malts. It is not too dominant or too forward, but it plays a great part in making a balanced, well-rounded whiskey. What do I mean by this? Mainly in Oloroso, or the sherry, let's say, is categorized by having kind of woody, floral, and kind of ripe stone fruit, dark fruit notes. Again, it is kind of a drier mouthfeel, probably because of the woody influence. But what's important is it is also soft and has a pretty full mouth feel, which I personally love in my whiskeys. So jumping into number 2, Pedro Jimenez whiskeys. Now, Pedro Jimenez is hard to say, so many times you're gonna see it written like this, just PX Sherry. And thank God, because that's a whole lot easier to say. So for the remainder of this video, I'm not going to say Pedro Jimenez, we're going to say PX. Just so you get used to it, not so I get tongue-tied. Now, Pedro Jimenez PX is, I would say, just up there with Oloroso. You see a lot of it. The flavors are very different, so how a master blender or a master distiller chooses to use one type of sherry over another really speaks to how they're planning for the whiskey to taste and be finished at the end. Do they want a sweeter or do they want a more balanced whiskey? Now, PX kind of grapes are grown again in the south of Spain, go figure, but you can also find them in different parts of the world. For instance, Australia and even parts of South America. They are what you might consider pre-treated grapes. And what does pre-treated mean? It only means, don't worry, they haven't added any chemicals or any components to it. It just means that they've been left out on the grapevines to completely dry out before they have been picked and kind of gone through the regular sherry process. This makes them extremely sweet, really brings that sweetness out, the drying on the grape wine, and really concentrates that sherry flavor. In fact, it has a lot of sherry content. PX can have up to 300 to 500 grams of sugar naturally per liter of sherry. That is a lot of sugar, and you really taste it. I mean, the sweetness, of course, but you really taste it when you're having a finished spirit there, because that sugar really coats and fills the barrel and harmonizes really well, and again, in my opinion, with the sugary wood notes or the sugary tannins of the American oak. Yes, most sherry is actually finished, or for the purposes of being used in whiskey, is filled into an American oak, not French oak barrel. Now, as you can imagine, having raisins. Raisins are pretty dark, they're almost black or really deep purple in color. It's not like a light red grape or even green, of course. And this really impales and plays a huge part in the color of the whiskey. I mean, as you can see from this, I'm just holding it backwards so you can kind of see that color better. It picks up a real dark reddish, almost like a honey kind of color to it, which again is a side part not of the whiskey that went in here. I mean, of course the whiskey was white, but more that dark dried raisin sherry color that comes out of PX. EX is probably a little bit of the, let's say, on the extreme side of sherries when you're talking about sweet, syrupy, really overwhelmingly forward sugar notes. So if you're having one, if you know you're having sherry side by side, you have a very dry one and you have a very fruity one, or you have a very sweet one, you're probably gonna know that's gonna be the PX, the sweet, of course. Now again, I'm gonna butcher this, so I'm sorry, but the third category of sherry we're gonna talk about is Manzanilla. Manzanilla, something like that. And here's an example of a whiskey that has Manzanilla sherry in it. I have to pour this out so you see the color. You're not going to see it here, but it is still a darker sherry color. It is not going to be as light as some of the whiskeys or some of the sherry finished whiskeys that we're going to talk about later, but it's also not as dark as the Oloroso. So just poured this out of the glass so you can give it a little look there. And as you can see, it is not quite the same as the PX, but it's also quite a bit darker than some of the other sherries that I also have here at home. Now, this Manzanilla sherry comes from Andalusia, Spain. Again, all of these are from the south of Spain. And there is a very interesting way in not only this one, but the last three kind of sherries that we're going to talk about, in not the grapes, but how they ferment this type of sherry. They follow a process called, or they use a certain type of yeast called floor yeast caps. And this is the concept of having, I mean, if you've made beer before or you've tried to make your own whiskey, you might have figured out that there are two main types of yeasts. There are top fermenting yeasts and there are bottom fermenting yeasts. Each one of them have their own pros and cons and give out kind of different flavors. Now, in some sherries, including this one here, this Manzanilla, I think I guess I have to call it M sherry for short, is a top fermenting, and it makes a really thick layer of yeast at the top. And this is very interesting because it makes a artificial barrier when the whiskey, or when the sherry, I'm sorry, is fermenting, because it keeps some of the oxygen out just by how thick that yeast layer, the coat, becomes, and it only lets kind of the particles, the carbon monoxide, exits. Very interesting. But from my very geeky perspective, I don't know if you can taste it. What again you most certainly see is the color. It is a paler color, even though this has been aged for 14 years, and this other one here was only aged for 7. Now this one here, I should also mention with the color, this is a first fill sherry barrel. I'm not sure what the other one is. That's not written on the label. Now again, Manzanilla is a not so common sherry. Of course, Oloroso and PX, you see them all the time, probably the most commonly used, but you're going to see these last three sometimes as well. And this is a great example. It's a delicious whiskey, but on a blind test, if somebody said, is that a sherry? You might be caught off guard. Now it's very interesting whiskey because again, it's on the drier side. So where it's not like the PX, it's not overly sweet. This one here is a little bit more acidic in flavor, and this kind of acidity gives a very interesting salty note and salty characteristic, which I think fits really well with certain whiskeys. Again, if you have kind of a space side or a whiskey that makes you kind of think of the ocean breeze, complementing it with a Manzanilla sherry finish might be the right way to bring that even more forward. Or if you have a whiskey that you want to bring that characteristics towards, a little bit salty air, but dry note characteristics. Did I also mention really full mouth kind of, you check that it's there. This might be a good finish to try. And if you don't think or haven't tried a sherry that kind of took you to that salty oceanside feeling or vibe, this might be something to experiment with. They also say you can get a little bit of like chamomile flavors, which, okay, now that I read it, sure, maybe. Now, in case you're not able to get your hands on this pintail, this is not a very commonly released, and I think this is bottle, oh my God, this is bottle 1 of 308. I didn't even notice that before. Can you see that down here at the very, very bottom? That's insane. Oopsie, I almost wish I never opened it. Oh, well, it tastes great, so I'm going to enjoy it. But another distillery is the Raza Distillery. Sorry, probably pronouncing it wrong. I'm butchering it. But they also make a very tasty Manzanilla sherry cask finish. Highly recommend it. Now, the fourth type of sherry that we're going to talk about is the Amontillado sherry. This one is interesting. It comes from the Montella region, and this is again south of Spain. And oh man, I'm sorry guys. If you thought I geeked out about the type of sherry before, this one's even more interesting. What's funny about it, or again interesting, is it's comes out, or you can kind of have this sherry anywhere between 16 and 22 ABV, which is pretty high for a wine if you think about it. Now, what's very interesting is the maturation kind of process, how they ferment and how they prepare it, is similar to Manzanilla. They have that floral or that kind of upper coat of yeast. However, they take it one step further. They actually go out of their way to kill and get rid of the yeast altogether. Now they do this because, again, that layer that's created on top is a little bit of a filter between what's happening outside of that cask or that container and the sherry that's underneath it. By killing and removing that yeast on top, they've now opened up. And by the way, how they kill it's pretty interesting. There's multiple kind of strategies to do this. One of which is to, literally just scoop it away or wait. The second is to add more fortified spirits. So high ABV alcohol, or hopefully sherry, or distilled sherry, to raise the ABV high enough to where the yeast can't survive anymore and it dies off. Now, why do they do this? Why do they go to such extents in order to make sure that the sherry or that floral level is gone? The reasoning is, by opening this sherry up again to the environment, the oxygen and the kind of the climate and everything around it, climate and everything around it, mixes in and starts to re-influence and add even more complexity to that sherry. Now, there is no set kind of time for how much longer they leave it out there. It's really up to the manufacturer to decide, hey, is 1 month, is 1 week enough, or do I need to go even longer? So there's a lot of variation here. But it does make for a more complex sherry, and it actually adds more colors because, again, the grapes and the different components, the skin and the compounds are still there. So feeding a little bit more and blending a little bit more over time. Now, this process, again, making it more complex, it also adds a lot of nutty, planty, earthy, some people say tobacco notes to a whiskey, which kind of sounds amazing to me. I really like a lot of this just gritty, kind of intense flavors, and it's not something that I really associate with a sherry, so I think it's very interesting. I wish I had one at home to kind of talk about and to recommend. Sadly, I don't. That's definitely on my list for whiskeys to look for. And in doing some pre-looking, I found that the Glenfiddich distillery does have an edition of the Amontillado sherry. And if I'm lucky, I'll be actually traveling to the south of Spain at the beginning of next year, 2024. I'm definitely going to keep my eye out for one of these sherries. Now, the final and the fifth type of sherry that we're going to talk about today, there's so many variations, is a Fino sherry. Now, Fino, kind of like what you'd expect from a name like Fino, kind of means that this whiskey is not very complex. There's not a lot of flavors in it. It's fine. Just like the other two whiskeys we talked about before it, it's fermented in the same way. There's a very top-heavy yeast, and this yeast kind of protects it from the outside world and keeps the complexity of it a little bit low. It's also not a grape, it's not a raisin, it's a grape variation, so it doesn't suck up or really get condensed with the flavors and colors. Now, this whiskey that I have here in front of me actually doesn't say what type of sherry is in it. So I'm kind of skeptical. I don't want to say or guess 100% that this is a Fino. However, based on the colors that I get out of it, I would hedge a bet and say it is. Also, if it was kind of a more renowned or well-known sherry, I think the chances are higher that it would have been written what type of sherry was used. Also, because this whiskey here is kind of an experimental, I mean, they finished it again with a cedar wood cask, or finished it in a cedar wood cask from Japan. I don't think they wanted the sherry to become too dominant and too overwhelming. In this case, a Fino sherry might be the best way to achieve that. So again, the Fino doesn't add a whole lot of color, of course, some color. It's definitely a grape, it's definitely in a cask, and that alone will influence a whiskey's final production. As far as flavors, it's pretty mild, again, fine, but you're gonna get those same fruity aromas that you might expect. Not a lot of sweet, not a lot of nut and earthy flavors, but a little bit of a fruity kind of expression. Kilchmon Distillery actually has a release of Fino, so they actually market it and say it's a Fino sherry, which again, haven't tried, but I like the fact that they're very forward with it, because again, in your sherry explorations, I think it's something that might be interesting to try, just so you figure out, okay, this is the most top of the mountain extreme here, top of the mountain extreme here, and in the valley, where does everything else fit? Now, there's a lot more about sherry to learn, and definitely a lot about sherry to enjoy, but I hope that covering these 5 major types of sherry gives you a little bit more information on A, what type of sherry you're enjoying, and even before, or if it's going to help you with your purchasing of a bottle, give you an idea of, okay, this one is going to be fine and fruity, this one is going to be dark and rich, and this one here is going to be something in the middle, right? So try them all out regardless of what I said or what you learned about it. It's all worth knowing and exploring. And with that, I will let you get to your glass of whiskey, maybe finished in sherry. Maybe you're drinking a sherry. Whatever it is, cheers to you and your next glass. Bye now.